By just reading a bit from the opening of the book. Our cellist left, didn't she? I have read this portion of the book so many times in the last 5 years that I'm capable of sort of disassociating while I'm reading it. And every once in a while, something snaps me back to reality. And there was one time I was in South Africa reading to a large room like this, and I suddenly snapped back to reality and realized I had no idea what the last words I had just read out loud were, and then attempted to cover that with a fake cough. And when I did cough, my hand came out of the book and the book closed, and I had no idea where in my own reading I was and had to start over and looked like an idiot. So these things can happen to anyone, and it doesn't mean you're actually doing anything wrong. It just means things are hard, and that's life. So, such is life. All right, I'm going to read from the beginning of the book. The book opens with an epigraph, which reads thusly. I'm just going to adjust this. Okay. Can you hear me all right? All right. The epigraph is this: you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. It screamed downward, splitting air and sky without effort. A target expanded in size, brought into focus by time and velocity. There was a moment before impact that was the last instant of things as they were. Then the visible world exploded. In 1945, an Italian musicologist found 4 bars of a sonata's bass line in the remnants of the firebombed Dresden Music Library. He believed these notes were the work of the 17th century Venetian composer Tommaso Albinoni, and spent the next 12 years reconstructing a larger piece from the charred manuscript fragment. The resulting composition, known as Albinoni's Adagio, bears little resemblance to most of Albinoni's work and is considered fraudulent by most scholars. But even those who doubt its authenticity have difficulty denying the Adagio's beauty. Nearly half a century later, it's this contradiction that appeals to the cellist, that something could be almost erased from existence in the landscape of a ruined city, and then rebuilt until it is new and worthwhile, gives him hope. A hope that now is one of a limited number of things remaining for the besieged citizens of Sarajevo, and that, for many, dwindles each day. And so today, like every other day in recent memory, the cellist sits beside the window of his second-floor apartment and plays until he feels his hope return. He rarely plays the Adagio. Most days, he's able to feel the music rejuvenate him as simply as if he were filling a car with gasoline. But some days, this isn't the case. If, after several hours, this hope doesn't return, he will pause to gather himself, and then he and his cello will coax Albinoni's Adagio out of the firebombed husk of Dresden and into the mortar-pocked, sniper-infested streets of Sarajevo. By the time the last few notes fade, his hope will be restored. But each time he's forced to resort to the Adagio, it becomes harder, and he knows its effect is finite. There are only a certain number of Adagios left in him, and he will not recklessly spend this precious currency. It wasn't always like this. Not long ago, the promise of a happy life seemed almost inviolable. 5 years ago at his sister's wedding, he posed for a family photograph, his father's arm slung behind his neck, fingers grasping his shoulder. It was a firm grip, and to some it would have been painful. But to the cellist, it was the opposite. The fingers on his flesh told him that he was loved, that he had always been loved, and that the world was a place where, above all else, the things that were good would find a way to burrow into you. Though he knew all of this then, he would give up nearly anything to be able to go back in time and slow down that moment, if only so he could more clearly recall it now. He would very much like to feel his father's hand on his shoulder again. He can tell today won't be an Adagio day. It has been only a half hour since he sat down beside the window, but already he feels a little bit better. Outside, a line of people wait to buy bread. It's been over a week since the market's had any bread to buy, and he considers whether he might join them. Many of his friends and neighbors are in line. He decides against it. For now, there's still work to do. It screamed downward, splitting air and sky without effort. A target, expanded in size, brought into focus by time and velocity. There was a moment before impact that was the last instant of things as they were. Then the visible world exploded. When the mortars destroyed the Sarajevo Opera Hall, the cellist felt as if he were inside the building, as if the bricks and glass that once bound the structure together became projectiles that sliced and pounded into him, shredding him beyond recognition. He was the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Symphony Orchestra. That was what he knew how to be. He made the idea of music an actuality. When he stepped on stage in his tuxedo, he was transformed into an instrument of deliverance. He gave to the people who came to listen what he loved most in the world. He was as solid as the vice of his father's hand. Now he doesn't care whether anyone hears him play or not. His tuxedo hangs in the closet, untouched. The guns perched on the hills surrounding Sarajevo have dismantled him, just as they have the opera, just as they have his family home in the night while his father and mother slept, just as they will, eventually, everything. The cellist doesn't know what is about to happen. Initially, the impact of the shell won't even register. For a long time, he'll stand at his window and stare. Through the carnage and confusion, he'll notice a woman's handbag, soaked in blood and sparkled with broken glass. He won't be able to tell whom it belongs to. Then he'll look down and see he has dropped his bow on the floor, and somehow it will seem to him that there's a great connection between these two objects. He won't understand what the connection is, but the feeling that it exists will compel him to undress, walk to the closet, and pull the dry cleaner's plastic from his tuxedo. He will stand at the window all night and all through the next day. Then, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 24 hours after the mortar fell on his friends and neighbors while they waited to buy bread, he will bend down and pick up his bow. He will carry his cello and stool down the narrow flight of stairs to the empty street. The war will go on around him as he sits in the small crater left at the mortar's point of impact. He'll play Albinoni's Adagio. He'll do this every day for 22 days, a day for each person killed. Or at least, he'll try. He won't be sure he will survive. He won't be sure he has enough adagios left. The cellist doesn't know any of this now, as he sits in his window in the sun and plays. He isn't yet aware, but it's already on its way. It screams downward, splitting air and sky without effort. A target expands in size, brought into focus by time and velocity. There is a moment before impact that is the last instant of things as they are. Then the visible world explodes. So that part is based on an incident that took place in May of 1992, in which a man named Vedran Smailovic, who was the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera, in response to what was the first bread line massacre in Vasimiskina, in which 22 people were shelled and killed while lining up to buy bread, he went and sat in the street where the shell had landed and played Albinoni's Adagio, the piece of music you heard earlier, every day for 22 days. I'm from Canada. I have no biographical connection to Sarajevo whatsoever. My family's not from there, and I had never been there. When the war was initially going on, I was not much interested in it. It like many world events that are currently going on and always going on, did not seem particularly connected to my day-to-day life or my personal experience, and I was loosely aware of it, but can't say that I spent a whole lot of time thinking about it. There was, however, a picture of Vedran Smilovich in the New York Times Magazine. And it was a picture of him in his tuxedo, looking pretty scruffy, pretty beat up, playing his cello, which, you know, a cello is a pretty beautiful physical object, in a street where the buildings had holes in them, bullet holes, mortar shell holes. The windows were broken. The paving stones of the street were dislodged. And it was very difficult to look at this image and think nothing about it and forget it. But 10 or 12 years went by and I didn't, you know, I remembered the picture, but I didn't really do anything about it. And then September 11th happened, and we began as a society to debate the relative merits of going to war in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It seems so very long ago now, and we're still there. Interesting. And regardless of whether you were for war, against war, undecided, what began to really stay with me and bother me was the ways we have invented mechanisms for not talking about the fact that in modern warfare, 9 out of every 10 people who are killed are civilians. For every bad guy we kill, we have to kill 9 people who aren't bad guys. And the phrase that was sort of the new phrase then was this phrase, collateral damage, which is the things we do with words. It's a really neat way of not talking about that and not thinking about that. And I mean neat in the sense of tidy, not in the sense of neat. And so I wanted to try to write about this. You know, what does war do to people who are not in the business of war? What does war do to people who aren't soldiers, doctors, journalists, you know, the usual people for whom, when war comes, they are there? What does it do to university students? What does it do to school teachers? What does it do to butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, those sorts of, you know, ordinary folk? And I realized I still remembered this picture of Vedran Smilovich sitting in the street, of the Cellist of Sarajevo sitting in the street. And that struck me as meaning something, because I'm a guy who forgets everything. I forget my children's birthdays. I sometimes have to do the math to remember how old I am. I get confused and lost easily. I'm not walking around with a steel vault in my brain. And yet this has stuck with me. And so I thought, well, any act of artistic expression has 2 entities to it. There's the performer, the person who makes it, and then there's the audience. And we tend to want to focus on the performer. You know, we tend to want to look at Smilovich or whomever is on stage, and we don't think about the audience. But without the audience, the performer is useless. And I realized, okay, what is interesting about this isn't that he did it, it's that it meant something to other people. And so from there I started writing about 3 fictional people who were trying to survive the siege of Sarajevo. And I'll come back to them in a second. But what I came to feel very strongly through the course of the writing of the book was that we need to pay more attention to 2 things, 2 very key things in our society. The first is what we imagine civilization to be. Very few people, you get the odd anarchist who is anti-civilization, but we agree in general that we are pro-civilization. But we believe civilization to be roads, bridges, buildings, schools, politics, stock markets, militaries, governments, We believe libraries. We look at all these things and believe them to be civilization, and we're wrong. These things are not civilization. These are the things that civilization allows us to have. What society is and what civilization is a very, very basic agreement we all have to behave in certain ways towards each other. This agreement has developed over the course of centuries of human existence. An example I will give you is murder. We understand that murdering people is a bad thing to do. There are times we all might like to do it. There are two reasons we don't. One is the obvious one. You go to jail. That's an easy one. But we're not walking around not murdering people because we don't want to go to jail, for the most part. The reason we're not walking around murdering people is that we understand it is wrong to murder people. We understand that if you kill someone else, you are a bad person. Now, I'm willing to bet you money there's been a time in human history where killing someone because they're annoying you has been a completely acceptable act, and no one much said anything about it. We have, over time, decided that, you know what, we can't function this way if I'm going to get my head lopped off at any moment for unfair reasons. Now, this has let us do things like build bridges, hospitals, schools, libraries, roads, all this stuff. You can take that as an extreme example and extrapolate down to small examples. We're able to walk through a shopping mall without all bumping into each other because we've developed sort of unspoken rules of what you're going to do when someone's coming at you. If you go to other places in the world, you will discover the rules of just walking down the street are different there. Walking down the street in Beijing, for example, is an entirely different proposition than walking down the street in New York. And it's because the rules are different. You can't look these rules up in a rule book. No one's written them down. It's just people have got it. And they've got it by having this sort of under the surface societal conversation about how we're going to all behave. And this conversation is going on constantly. Unfortunately, every once in a while, it fails us. The siege of Sarajevo happened for many reasons, and there are many sort of political reasons it happened, and all sorts of reasons, but on a base level, the siege of Sarajevo took place because the conversation they had going on what a society was and what civilization was failed them. When this conversation fails, there are ways to restart it, but the most indestructible way that human beings have ever come up with to restart or to maintain the conversation of what civilization is artistic expression and engagement with artistic expression. When we look at the picture of Vedran Smailović or listen to him play in the street and are thinking about what it is we're witnessing, we are engaging in the conversation of civilization, because you can look at what he did there almost any possible way you want. On one hand, you could look at it from the, what the heck is he doing? That is utterly ridiculous. That man is a raging lunatic. He's sitting in the middle of a street with snipers shooting at him and bombs raining down, and he's playing a piece of classical music. Bravo. That's not gonna, sorry, can you not see? You can edit. Back up. Yeah, sorry. I teach university. Don't applaud for that. Now you're getting me in trouble. You can look at that and say, that is not going to accomplish anything whatsoever. And you may well be right, because he played in May of 1992 and that war went on for 3.5 more years. Or, on the other hand, you can look at that and say, that is one of the most beautiful expressions of humanity I have ever seen. what are we doing here? Stop blowing stuff up around us. And then any amount of derivation in between. You know, you can come up with an infinite number of ways of looking at that. And that act itself, deciding what he's doing there, is civilization. In a way that a sewage pipe or electricity or a hospital isn't civilization, because you can blow up all those things. You can turn the lights out, you can stop the water, but you can't stop that. Now, in service of this, we have to be very, very careful in our society, particularly American and North American society. There are many, many people out there who are trying to convince us, and will continue to try forever and ever and ever to convince us that engagement with artistic expression, and I'm not talking about the artists, we're not going to go away, but for you, they will try to tell you that engaging with artistic expression is an elitist pastime. You go and see a movie or a play or read a book or all this sort of stuff when your stomach is full, your wallet is full, all your important actual business of the day is done, and that it's entertainment and that it is kind of froofy. There's a phrase my mother uses, I'm sure you've heard of it, artsy fartsy. This is a dangerous, I get in arguments with my mom, this is a societally dangerous phrase. When you marginalize, when you say to people, this is silly, don't do it, you're basically saying don't participate in civilization. So I think we have to be very cognizant about, number one, resisting people who would try to advance this theory. Remember, if you will, that every dictator that has ever come to power has immediately put artists in jail. Immediately. And the reason they do this is not got anything to do with the artists, though it is true they are often of objectionable moral character and inconvenient to be around. The reason they do this is because they're afraid of the audience. They're afraid of what other people might think in response to the work the artist is producing. So, as an act of civilization, you need to, number one, resist the people who are trying to tell you that this is not something worth doing with your time. And number two, make sure that you do it, because it is working hard. If we go back to the object example of the Cellist of Sarajevo, people's desire to listen to music, read books, look at paintings, go to the theater, watch movies, does not diminish in times of societal breakdown. When civilization teeters on the edge, artistic production goes up. There were 50 cellists of Sarajevo in Sarajevo. You know, there were myriad people doing these things. There were string quartets. There were people playing, risking their lives to play at funerals. Why would you bother playing at funeral? 10,000 people were killed in a city of 500,000. Why would you bother to play at a funeral? I mean, death would be so obvious. Why even have a funeral, for that matter? Because one is a choice to say the world is still a place where it means something when someone dies, and the other is to give up. So these things go on and increase, and our engagement with them increases. So that is one of the main things the book is about. Now, from there, as a base point, it takes three fictional characters who are in a way archetypes, but are not real people. One is a man named Dragon, who's an older man, and his wife and son have fled to Italy at the start of the war, and he's sort of given up. He wouldn't go to a funeral. You know, why would I go to a funeral? Someone's dead. Great. No, someone just died there. Someone just died there. And he's trying to get to the bakery where he works to get a loaf of bread, and he ends up getting stuck at an intersection he can't cross because there's a sniper picking people up, and spends the book there having to talk to an old friend that he's been avoiding, because you don't talk to old friends in times of war, because what's the first thing you do when you see a friend? What do you say? How's it going? Well, how do you answer that question? How's it going? Obviously not very well. But what are you gonna walk around? How's it going? Not very well. You? Not very well. Like, you just stop that entirely. So that's Dragon. He's forced to talk to her. And then there's Kennan, who's a man in his late 30s, early 40s, who every 5 days has to go down a hill, across a bridge, and up a hill to the Sarajevo brewery to get water for his family. You cannot go very long without water, a couple days at most, and then you just die. If you don't die of thirst, you die of one of the many, many diseases you can get from not washing yourself. And in a city that does not have very simple things like antibiotics, that's kind of a big deal. So he has no choice. He has to go out and risk his life every 5 days to get water. He's also made a promise to his neighbor, Mrs. Rostovsky, an old lady who lives downstairs and who is just awful. She's just a mean person. But the question asked is, what does it mean to do a favor for someone who wouldn't do it for you? Who benefits from these favors, and why do we do them? So he sort of struggles with that. And then the third character, who I'm going to finish with a short reading from, and then you can ask questions if you have them, is a woman named Arrow. Arrow's about 28, 29. She was in university, and before her father was a policeman, so she was a target shooter. It was a sort of popular sport in the former Yugoslavia. And that ended up being a not great skill set to have if you didn't want to end up recruited into the defense of Sarajevo. It was a completely civilian defense force for the most part. So she ends up being a sniper, counter-sniper, sort of tasked with defending the city. So her job is to shoot as many soldiers as she can. She gets tasked with protecting the cellist from a man sent down to kill him. In the part where I'm going to read, she's hiding in the streets, in a building, waiting for 4 o'clock to come. The day before, she was hiding in a different spot, and the other sniper got the jump on her and fired at her. And he missed, but when she was out of the picture, so to speak, he had a shot at our cellist, and he didn't take it. She doesn't know why, and it's been bothering her all day long. She can't figure out why he didn't kill the cellist. It would have been the easiest thing to do. So this has been gnawing away at her as she lays on her stomach and waits for 4 o'clock. The day goes slowly. She hears heavy shelling to the west in the direction of Darmania and Moilomo. A part of her wishes she could be there. She thinks of the people who, because she has been here for the past 3 days, she has not shot. Men who hate her, men who would kill her, men who have killed people like her in the last 3 days because she did not kill them first. But even then, she begins to wonder about this. Do the men on the hills hate her, or do they hate the idea of her because she's different from them? And that in this difference, there might be some sort of inferiority or superiority that is hers or theirs. That, in the end, threatens the potential happiness of everyone. She begins to wonder whether they fight against an idea, and that fight manifests itself as hatred. If so, they are no different from her, except for one key detail that simply can't be ignored or pushed aside. The idea she felt prepared to give her life for was not one that could include the hatred she feels for the men on the hills. The Sarajevo she fought for was one where you didn't have to hate a person because of what they were. It didn't matter what you were, what your ancestors had been, or what your children would be. You could hate a person for what they did. You could hate a murderer, you could hate a rapist, and you could hate a thief. This is what first drove her to kill the men on the hills, because they were all these things. But now she knows she's mainly driven by a hatred of them, the idea of them as a group, and not by their actions. This realization stuns her, and she feels an impulse to leave her rifle where it lies and return to her apartment. But she doesn't. She stays where she is. At 4 o'clock, the cellist comes out, and her finger tightens around the trigger. The sniper shows himself almost immediately. He's in a second-story window, one of the 3 she first suspected. As the cellist begins to play, the sniper appears through a hole in the plastic, one that wasn't there before and isn't very well hidden. Arrow is surprised by how easy it is to spot him. The sniper puts the cellist in his sights. Arrow is about to send a bullet into him, but stops. His finger isn't on the trigger. This isn't a detail she would usually notice or care about, but she can see it in her scope, and it makes her pause. His hand isn't even in the vicinity of the trigger. His right hand holds the uppermost point of the stock, and his shot is clear, but his left hand isn't on his rifle. It hangs down to his side, out of her view. She wonders whether he can hear the music. He's not much farther from the cellist than she is, so he must. Does it sound the same to him? What does he hear? What does he think about this man who sits in the street and plays? For several minutes, Arrow does nothing. She watches the sniper through the scope of her rifle and listens to the music lift off the street. It makes her sad. A heavy, slow kind of sad. The sort that does not bring you to tears, but makes you feel like crying. It is, she thinks, the worst feeling there could be. Her finger is still on the trigger. If he moves, she will fire. But he does not move. The music is nearly finished, and he hasn't shifted a millimeter. She begins to doubt herself, wonder if he's real, if it's possible he's a decoy. But then he moves, and she knows what she sees is a person. His head leans back slightly, and she sees that his eyes are closed, that he's no longer looking through his scope. She knows what he's doing. It's very clear to her, unmistakable. He's listening to the music. And then Arrow knows why he didn't fire yesterday. She wants him to move his hand, to make a move that will decide for her what she will do, because she is at once sure of 2 things. The first is that she does not want to kill this man, and the second is that she must. Time is running out. There's no reason not to kill him. A sniper of his ability has, without doubt, killed dozens, if not hundreds. Not just soldiers, women crossing streets, children in playgrounds, old men in water lines. She knows this to a certainty, yet she doesn't want to pull her trigger, all because she can see that he doesn't want to pull his. He hasn't moved. He still sits with his eyes closed, one hand on the stock of his rifle, the other at his side. The final notes of the cellist's melody reach him, and he smiles. His eyes open, and a small hole erupts between them. The back of his head disintegrates, and the gray viscous of his brain slaps onto the wall behind him. He falls from sight, and his rifle falls on top of him. Arrow lowers her rifle and looks down at the street. The cellist has finished. He picks up his stool and cello and heads for his door. He pauses just before he enters, and she wonders if he will look in her direction. Even though he can't possibly see her, she wants him to turn towards her, to acknowledge her in some way. The cellist adjusts his grip on his instrument and disappears into the building. All right, thanks. All right, are there any of you with questions you would like to ask? Bearing in mind there are no stupid questions, only stupid answers, so the burden's mostly on me. Oh, yeah, we'll go that way. Why would the cellist play in a crater? Well, it wouldn't have been a deep crater. maybe just like a slight indentation. He played, I mean, in real life he moved around a bit, but generally he played where the bomb landed, to sort of reclaim the space, I guess. Now, why he actually went out into the street and did it is an excellent question for which I don't think there is necessarily an answer. He may have snapped. He may have not. Almost the point of what he did is to wonder why he did it and ask that question and try to come to some conclusion. Life is full of unanswerable questions, and the answer isn't always the point, I think, particularly in the case of this. Yeah.
The perspective of the piece is told through 3 different people, right?
Yeah.
As you said. So why is it that you decided not to tie these people together in the conclusion?
For a couple reasons. Thanks, good question. One is that, you know, take any one of them, arrow. There were dozens of arrows, not literally, but, you know, dozens, hundreds of people doing what Arrow was doing, trying to figure out how to fight and kill people without becoming the thing you hated, and without, you know, ruining your own city. People in Sarajevo were very invested in the idea that this whole ethnic conflict that was going on was not their deal. They didn't, you know, there were Serbs fighting Serbs, you know, and so that they were struggling with this. Same with Dragon and Kennan, there were dozens of them. And if they met each other, then it would be more about them as people and their relationships. And the other answer is Albinoni's Adagio is a piece of music that's a trio sonata, or based on a trio sonata. And in a trio sonata, there are 3 distinct parts, a melody and 2 bass lines, that are supposed to function independently, i.e. you could listen to each one of them separately and it would sound like a piece of music, the way you can't, you know, listen to the bass line from a pop song and it will sound like anything other than the bass line, or, you know, you need all of them together. So the book is intended to be structured like that, so you could just read Kennan and it should ought to work. Or you could just read one of the 3 and you should be able to get a story, but if you read all 3 of them, it should work slightly better to, you know, so, yes.
You were discussing how the people, like the one character in Lost Code, was basically hopeless in the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the cellist himself his actions, were they kind of suicidal? Like, had he lost hope, or was he just on the dead in his own way?
This is pure speculation. I don't feel that the cellist thought much at all when he went out there. I think it was a reaction to an incident. He's a cellist. What is he going to do, right? That's the thing he knows how to do. All of us, when we are sort of pushed to a pressure point, tend to do the thing that we do. So for him to go, like for you or I to go and sit out in the street and do that would be a remarkable and odd thing. For him to do that, that's what he did. I think probably there was an element of him saying, yeah, I don't care if you kill me. Go ahead and kill me. Someone else will sit here afterwards. But I don't personally think he had snapped. I think he had just reached a point where he was so frustrated with the situation that he did the thing he did, and was willing to accept whatever consequences came from it.
And do we know, did the cellist have family? Do we know anything about the background of the cellist? Did he have family or anything?
Within the book, we don't. In real life, he was a colorful character within the world of Sarajevo. He was a man prone to grandiose gestures. He was once arrested in Sarajevo for blocking traffic with a horse and buggy in like 1989 to protest modernization and streetcar expansion. He was a man prone to melodramatic, large-scale gestures his whole life, as some people are. Yeah. Yes.
The repetition of passages played a very large role throughout the entire book.
Sorry, I missed.
The repetition of passages played a very large role throughout the book. Why did you choose to include this technique in your writing?
Yeah, for those of you who didn't hear, the question was the repetition of certain passages played a role in the book. Passages and images, partly because that's what music does, right? Like music uses runs of notes or repetitions of things, and the idea is if you're doing it right, you're modulating what it means. So, the image of broken glass is a image that the book uses a lot, in just various ways of talking about broken glass. And hopefully by the end, broken glass means something slightly different than it did at the beginning to you, the reader. And also just to suggest similarity of common experience between the characters, back to the question of how come they didn't meet. Well, they didn't meet, but they did in a way, because they were all doing the same, they were in the same space with the same problems. They were hearing the same shells, not necessarily literally, but they were trying to, the pavement felt the same. Like there were huge similarities going on all the time, so repetition is a way you can kind of get at that without being too overt. Maybe there was someone, I've been showering this side with. Yeah.
You said that you knew nothing about the war, then how did you write the book?
Well, I knew nothing about the war at the time. Then when I started working on the book in about 2003, I did all the things writers normally do. I read everything I could find. I watched all the documentary footage that, one could see just to know what the city looked like. And then I found some people who had lived through the war in Sarajevo and spent countless hours with them trying to understand what they understood and let them tell me what they wanted to tell me and hear stories and look for patterns in stories. Being a fiction writer is very much about, at least the sort of fiction I write, it's about, Stephen Colbert's concept of truthiness, that the truth is what I believe it to be, which is another way of saying that the truth is stranger than fiction. Fiction isn't necessarily about what is true, it's about what you will believe to be true. So you hear 20 stories and then you try to invent the 21st. That is the most believable version of those 20 stories that people will be able to read and not say, that wouldn't happen. Yes?
So you touched briefly on the idea of why do a favor for someone if they wanted to for you, but why is there a connection between Miss Rostovsky and Kenneth?
Sorry, can you ask that again? I'm ahead of brain.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You kind of talked about why do a favor for someone
Yeah.
if they would never do that for you.
Mm-hmm.
But why include this between Miss Rostovsky and Kenneth?
Right. Well, here's the question that one has. Okay, so let's say that you have to do what Kenneth has to do, right? You have to, every 5 days, take a whole bunch of empty bottles of water and, risk getting shot constantly or shelled or die to get water for your family. It's one thing to do this act when it's for people you love, right? It's one thing, it's almost oddly heroic to do it as a act of altruism towards people who you are indebted to. It's a completely different thing once Mrs. Rostovsky comes into the picture, because there's no way she would get him water. She's not even grateful that he gets her water. She's kind of aggressive to him about it. And so that kind of, to me, made him ask the question, of what kind of person do I want to be? How am I going to let this war dictate my own humanity to me? I mean, I'll give you an example. I live in Vancouver, and the people come to Vancouver in Canada from Toronto, Canada, constantly. I feel like I do very little other than pick people up from the airport and drive them around to their hotel and show people around Vancouver. People from Toronto. I have been to Toronto 100 times and no one has ever picked me up from the airport. The same people. And my wife asks me, why don't you just tell them to take a cab? Do they pick you up from the airport? And I think, no, they don't. But frankly, I like it when people come to my city that they're treated well and driven to their hotel from the airport. Now that's a low risk scenario for me because what do I burn? A couple bucks in gas in an hour of my time, no big deal, and I get to feel better than my friends and like a good person. That dynamic changes entirely when you're risking your life to do it and the person is aggressive. But you still are asking yourself, am I the sort of person who would get water for an old lady or not? And the answer means something to you as a human being. When that person wouldn't reciprocate, that is different than when they would. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
So we've been seeing the Arab Spring revolutions, rebellions, like the past years. So, and you've been seeing like the atrocities against the citizens there.
Yeah.
But you've also been seeing the international support that's been going in, like Libya,
Yep.
and now the declaration of war with Turkey and Syria. So what makes, I guess, why wasn't there an international support?
That's a very good question. There was, in a way, the UN was on the ground there. Was that bell a go-away bell? Okay. I'll finish this answer and then you can go away. Peacekeeping has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. In 1992, the attitude of the West was that no one can die peacekeeping. We were essentially putting our soldiers in this untenable position where we were asking them to go in and break up a fight, but in sort of the most useless way, like by basically saying, hey guys, no. Because we didn't have the will to actually get involved. She's in trouble. Whereas now and because of what a disaster that was, we now understand that, if you're gonna step into the middle of a fight, you might get punched, so to speak, which has made, in some ways, our response more difficult because, we understand in the context of, say, currently Syria, that if we go charging in, we're going to end up in another war. But I imagine if we did go charging in, the outcome would be better. I think the West's policies towards peacekeeping and interventionism prolonged the siege in Sarajevo because we created the perfect conditions for it not to end. So the world is very complicated. I write books. I don't always understand these things, but that's my take on it. Anyway, I'm going to release you to the wilds now. So thank you very much.